I'm Daniel Ballinger, the product manager for Apex.
And I'm Marcus Nabrand. I'm an architect on the Apex team.
Okay. Today we're going to run you through 5 key areas. First, we'll go through some important changes that are coming to the security model in Apex that you'll need to know about as you're creating new classes. Marcus will run us through some new language runtime features that will enhance and improve your code that you're creating. We'll talk about integrations, specifically with agent actions and how you can use Apex in those scenarios. Marcus will again run us through some new improvements coming to testing framework for new features you'll be able to use to increase your ability to test code from Apex. And then finally, we'll go through some enhancements coming for ISVs in the App Exchange before going over the overall roadmap. At the end, I'll give you a link that you can get a QR code from, and you'll be able to get all these slides if you need them. Great, so first, let's get into what's coming for security in Apex. Historically, when Apex was first introduced, almost way back in 2007, there were basic operations you could do. So you could look at your schema and say, did I have access to this object? Do I have access to those fields? A big jump forward in history, and then we added the inherited sharing keyword in 2019. This gave you an ability to handle scenarios where you might have otherwise omitted the sharing keyword and to base the sharing model based on the caller of that code. Around the same time in 2019, we also added with security enforced. This is a much simpler mechanism in your SOCL queries to determine which fields and which objects the user should have access to and to reject those requests if the current user didn't have that access. To complement with security enforced, we also add security strip and accessible. This was a much more flexible mechanism if you needed to dynamically scale up or down the level of access you should have. And then in 2023, we basically superseded with security enforced by introducing with user mode. This was a much more complete mechanism to enforce the security model in both your SOCL, your SOSL, and your DML statements. And that brings us to the next change that we're making to the security model in Apex, which is switching to a secure by default posture. And this is going to impact your code in 3 key areas. Your sharing declarations, so those without sharing declarations, whether the code is running in system mode or user mode by default, and then also what this means for the existing with security enforced keywords. So today, there are essentially 4 flavors of the sharing declaration that you would put at the top of any one of your Apex classes. The most common and the most highly recommended is always start with sharing. That's the most secure position. It'll enforce the user's security level of access and ensure that you only expose records to them that they have access to. Now, that's not always what you need your code to do. Sometimes you need to be able to do a targeted escalation in your code and have the code provide records that the user otherwise wouldn't have access to. That's where without sharing comes in. And that allows you to bypass those, access them, and have the code do escalations on the customer's behalf. Now, there's a third and more complicated scenario here, which is inherited sharing. That's important for scenarios where you need flexibility in your code to make that decision to do with or without sharing based on the caller. Inherited sharing is also important because if by some chance the class becomes the entry point to the transaction, it'll default to with sharing. So all those are excellent mechanisms if you need to use them. The complicated scenario is omitted sharing, where you don't put a sharing declaration at the top of the class. I think we'll run you through a flowchart here, and we'll show you what comes up with that complication. But generally, it's not recommended. One important thing to remember is if you're using user mode explicitly, it will override those 3 other sharing levels and essentially behave as if it was with sharing. So it's an important thing to remember. So in that scenario where you have omitted the sharing declaration, what actually happens? Well, okay, first, before we go down that branch, obviously if you put an explicit sharing declaration, it does exactly what it says and will enforce that model that you've asked it to. That's a really easy way to reason about, and that's why it's recommended that any of your classes that will ultimately do DML or SOCL, either directly in them or in another class that they call, explicitly have a declaration in them. Now, this is where it gets complicated. If you do not have a sharing declaration, there's kind of a decision tree we need to work down. If that class extends another class, you're basically inheriting, then the definition of what sharing model is applied is actually defined by that parent class. So you sort of have to restart up at the top node for that class. And now, historically, before we've introduced our security by default changes, there's another more complicated branch down here, which depends on, is this class an entry to the transaction? Was it called by another transaction? What type of entry point was it? And it actually gets very complicated and very difficult to reason about what sharing mode is actually being applied. This is where our first API version change in version 67, so when you declare your class, if it's bound to version 67, and if you're coming down this tree, decision tree, where there's no sharing declaration, it will just default to with sharing, so secure by default. You, of course, still have full control. If you want to declare without sharing or inherited sharing, you can do so, but it's important to know that model will change when the API version of the class changes to 67. Now, back in 2023, when we introduced with user mode, Chris Peterson, who was the product manager at the time for Apex, had this to say about the historic with security enforced. It was essentially a mistake. It made sense at the time, but we realized there was a number of shortcomings in it, which were superseded by with user mode. And so going forward in summer 26, we're actually fully deprecating with security enforced. So if your class is version 67 or higher, and you try and compile using with security enforced, it will be rejected. By the compiler, you'll get an error message telling you exactly that. The general reason is with security enforced has a number of shortcomings, particularly around where clauses. It doesn't actually enforce the field level security on those fields. And also, if it failed and gives you an exception message, it won't give you a clear indication of which field it failed on. So all around, it's much better to use with user mode. And it's actually recommended that you go back through your older code, find usages of with security enforced, and switch them over to with user mode. If user mode is not fully sufficient for your needs, the next recommendation is to switch to strip inaccessible, which gives you a very fine level of control of how field level access is enforced. Right. So the other third part of the secure by default change is DML and SOCL operations, and SOCL. So if you were to make one of these operations today, like this, in version 66 or lower of the API, and you were to omit a user mode declaration, these all essentially behave as if they were system mode, which is a lot of power for your code. Like, it will access records the user doesn't have access to, will access fields, et cetera, that the user doesn't have access to. As a change in summer 26, so again, when the API version of the class becomes 67 or higher, these will now behave as if you had explicitly written these declarations. They will become implicitly user mode operations. So if you omit, I'll just repeat that again so it's clear, if you omit the user mode operation on your class, it will default to user mode. But again, you still have full control as a developer. You can explicitly ask for system mode when it makes sense. You just have to be explicit. Right, with that, I'll pass it over to you, Marcus, to run us through some runtime features.
Thank you. Right, the first thing I want to talk to you about is a big forward-looking announcement, and that is that API version retirement is coming to Apex. A lot of you might be already familiar with this process for the platform APIs. A bunch of API versions have already been retired there, and we are introducing a similar process to Apex. So there's no set timetable yet, no need to panic, but anticipate that in the near future, Apex API version will be retired. It's going to be a release update process. There's going to be multiple stages, multiple release updates. We're still in the middle of figuring out the details on this, but we want to share this early with you and share some recommendations, what you can do to get your orgs ready for that. So this will be a very painless process once this rolls out. Generally, our recommendation is you should maintain a consistent API version across all your Apex classes and triggers in your org. Ideally, you aim for the highest API version that's available at Salesforce today. There's, of course, the staggered release schedule that you have to keep in mind there, right? So your scratch orgs and your sandboxes might be on an older API version than what's available for your production org. So in those scenarios, going for the very highest might not make sense because you wouldn't have a way of deploying those to production. But as a rule, stay within the last 3 years of released API versions. So this would be 9 versions back. And these retirement release updates will not ever impact the Apex because they will never go into those windows. The benefits you'll get from that is you have a better security posture for the Apex code in your org. The announcement Daniel just made, things like the secure by default changes, you will benefit from automatically by updating your Apex code. You will have consistency throughout your code base, so which fields, which S objects are visible or not visible across different API boundaries. That's not something you have to think and worry about a lot if you keep a consistent API version. And for performance fixes, we sometimes have to grandfather in old behavior, even though it's slower, because we can't break existing code out there, but you will benefit from fixes the Apex team makes in that area automatically just by updating your code. We are also working on a couple of things that should make your life easier in upgrading your Apex. So the first thing there is we're working on a new doc page that's a collated reference of all the API version behavior in Apex. So it's easy for you if you upgrade from some older version to a new version to go through the full list of stuff that happened since then, and you can get a feel of what might impact this class when I update it. There's a couple of ways that you can easily find out what API versions are in your org today. So the easiest would be you go through the setup UI, the Apex class page, and then you just sort the list view by API version. API version is also available on the Apex class S object, so you can use SOCL or the developer console to query this. And of course, it's in the meta XML file in your SFDX project. Same for triggers. Another way we are surfacing API version information in some other Apex health metrics is the new agentic setup pages and the org health parts. So which versions in your Apex classes in your org are within the recommended range of API versions is visible there. It can give you a list of API versions and classes. And like you see in the bottom left, there's also other Apex health metrics that we are surfacing in that new agentic setup experience. So one of them, for example, is async Apex consumption and scheduled job usage, what invalid Apex classes are in your org. And async Apex is also something I want to talk about a bit more next. So let's imagine you have some Apex code in your org that's hooked up to some direct user interaction, and it's enqueuing a job and response. There's no real good way for you, right, to know how often is this user interaction going to happen in a day, how many async jobs am I going to enqueue throughout the day, am I going to hit a limit or not. Oftentimes, there is really important for you to get this job actually enqueued and through, or you might have some data inconsistency or data loss in your org that you want to avoid at all costs. So today, what happens if you actually hit the limit, right? You get the system async exception. In theory, this is a catchable exception, right? You could write code that somehow stashes this data away somewhere and write some other async scheduled job that picks it up later when there's capacity again. But like in practice, this is extremely hard to react to, and it's very difficult to write code that reacts to the limit being hit. So let's look at what this looks like today on a graph. The blue line here, this is your async Apex limit. Your consumption goes up in your org through the day. When you hit the limit, you basically hit the hard wall today. From now on, you will get exceptions until the hourly window recovers some capacity from the last 24 hours. No enqueue will work. So functionality that relies on enqueues and async jobs is going to be hard down until capacity is recovered. We are introducing a new feature in summer 26 as a beta opt-in for production orgs that's going to switch this to elastic limits. So what does that mean? Instead of instantly cutting you off and failing in queues, when you hit your licensed limit, in queues will still go through, but we will throttle the dequeue of these jobs in your org. But you will no longer hit the hard wall. Up to 2x your limit, you can still enqueue jobs successfully. It will just be throttled down on the dequeue. It's an opt-in for production orgs. It's going to be available on the Apex settings page. You just have to click a checkbox to opt in. For now, it's just targeting queuable and future jobs, but we are actively working on also getting this to work for batch and scheduled, the other async Apex types. And yeah, it's still a hard wall at 2x the limit, but you're not going to be cut off immediately. So this is going to give you some time to react. How can you monitor this? So like today, you can go to the Apex jobs page, and you see the % of your async daily limit that you used. Just Now this number can basically go above 100%. Before you hit the hard wall, now you see here, right, you have 120%, for example, of your async capacity used. That means your org is like in elastic limits territory. There's also programmatic ways of checking these new elastic limits. So the org limit API that you can already use today to check your daily async limit. For the existing one, what you have to keep in mind is that until now, this couldn't exceed. So get value could never exceed get limit. This is no longer true. Now, if you're in elastic territory in your org, get value can actually exceed the limit. And there are two new keys in that API, the daily async apex elastic execution limit. That's going to give you the higher elastic limit your org has now. Get value is the same, though. It's what you incubed the last 24 hours as for the existing one. And the daily async apex processed one, this is what you can use to check, is there throttling actively applied to my org today? Whenever the get value of this is over get limit, it means like in the last 24 hours, we dequeued more jobs than your license allows, and we are actively throttling the dequeue of your jobs. These two new keys, they will only be available in that API if you opted into the feature. So you have to enable that feature, opt into the elastic limits, then these two new keys are going to be available in that API. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Daniel to talk about multi-line strings.
Cool, thank you. So a lot of you are probably familiar. You have some large string payload. Here we've got some JSON, but this could be XML, a SOQL query, a prompt to a LLM. So you have this large payload, and you want to represent it in your Apex code. So what do you do today? You might do something like this. You would encode it as a string in Apex. But you'll notice that comes with a degree of ceremony or degree of overhead in the expression of that multi-line string in Apex. I have to terminate each line with a quote character. I might have to encode a new line character there, and then have to add a plus, and then repeat for every single line. That actually adds a lot of maintenance overhead for both you as the person who's bringing this payload into your JSON, into your Apex code, and also for people who are doing maintenance of it. It's a lot harder to read. There's a lot more overhead, and you're actually using, like, in this case, 18% more characters than just representing it just with the overhead of all those extra encodings for every single line. Right. So based on your idea exchange ideas, we have implemented this new feature in Apex. It is a multi-line string. It's a small thing, but it's a quality of life improvement for developers. Thank you. So it's fairly basic syntax. You use 3 single quotes to open the multi-line string, put your payload in, 3 single quotes to end that multi-line string. Now, obviously, this is nice. You don't need all the extra characters per line. You can bring the payload in really easily. It has some other nice features hiding away here. It's automatically encoding the new line characters. If you did not wish to have that new line character encoded, you can terminate the line with a backslash, and that will suppress that trailing new line character. Also, it strips white space from the end of the strings. If you wish to keep extra white space, you can use the new /s, which is an encoded white space, to keep that white space at the end of the string. And it will also do indenting for you. It'll strip out all the leading white spaces up to the least indented character. I think that's right, isn't it, Marcus? Yeah. You'll understand it when you use it. Like, so if you were to bring one of the characters in, you can change the indentation. But it should naturally flow with normally indented code. Now, the observant among you may actually notice something else here. We've also added a new method to strings called template. This takes a map of keys, and it will search through the string for that matching key, see with the dollar notation, and substitute the value from the map where it sees that. So again, this is another nice quality of life improvement feature, so you don't have to keep escaping in and out of the string to substitute the variables in. You can do it all through a map input. That is also using case-sensitive keys as a mechanism for that map. So just be aware when you're putting values into that map, they are case-sensitive by the key. But it will make that substitution a lot easier, especially when you have a large payload to do the substitutions in. One thing to bear in mind, while it is now a lot easier to put these larger strings in Apex, at some point you have to make the decision, would this be better off, especially if it's a really like hundreds of line payload, as something like a static resource, which is better represented and managed in metadata that way. But for direct payloads like this, your SOQL queries, it'll be much easier. And again, this came from your idea exchange votes, so thank you for that. It helps us shape that product as we move forward. So, integrations. Many of you have been working with agents and want to be able to reuse some of your existing code that you have in Apex with those agents. So we've given you a number of mechanisms for how to expose your existing Apex to those agents for consumption. Obviously, you can use your invocable methods. You can use your REST resources, but you can also now use your Aura-enabled Apex. To enable those for use in agents, you need to go to VS Code and generate an OpenAPI doc from your Aura endpoint, from your class. You can do that through the menu options there. And that will generate an external services resource with the OpenAPI specification that describes your Aura-enabled endpoint. And now you can metadata deploy that new file as part of your source code to your org. And then once it's in your org, it now appears in the OpenAPI catalog, and the person configuring the agent can just select it as another agent action. And it'll bring through a lot of the metadata from that OpenAPI spec. It's a small feature, but if your Aura-enabled actions are suitable for exposure to agent, it's a quick path through to enable that. Right, Marcus, do you want to run us through some improvements for testing?
Great. Thank you. So I want to talk about a new developer preview feature we are rolling out with Summer 26 that we're calling integration tests. So as all of you know, hopefully, Apex unit tests today, they are the key to delivering high-quality apps, and they are providing you robust test isolation. But this test isolation comes at a cost. So what this means is not all scenarios that you might want to test are available to be tested in Apex tests today. Example are agent-force interactions, interactions with data 360, things like field history that rely on the actual transaction being committed. They are not available for you to test in Apex tests today. So we are introducing a new type of Apex test that we are calling integration tests. As I mentioned, it's going to be a scratch-org-only developer preview in Summer 26. And this type of test gives you explicit transaction control and allows side effects so you can do true end-to-end testing of your integrations and do not have an isolated rollback test like traditional Apex unit tests give you. And let's jump right into what an example of one of these looks like. So integration tests you declare via annotation similar to @istTest. There's now an @integration test. There's also an integration test class that provides some APIs. In this scenario, we are using integration test.commitTest only to actually have multiple transactions happen in one test and commit truly to the org. And this data will exist in the org. There's not going to be any rollback. There's not going to be any isolation. And because of that, we are also introducing @teardown, which is very similar to @testSetup. It's going to be executed after your test runs. Because of this side effect, it means you are also responsible for cleaning up whatever test data you might have inserted, so your test is repeatable. You cannot rely on the rollback of the test transaction. You have to clean up whatever data and side effects your test inserted into your org by hand. But in this example, it's account history. This was a feature that traditionally you could not write an Apex test for. Field history, feed history, S-object history, these were not written out in old Apex unit tests because the rollback would prevent the write-out of this. With commits now and transaction control, you can write tests against these features. Another example, if you wanted to write some Apex that interacts with an agent and want to do a true end-to-end test, and you want to do this in an Apex test today, calling an invocable action that calls agent-force, we would block you in Apex unit tests and say you cannot make callouts in an Apex unit test. In integration tests, this is allowed. We will let you insert an account here, ask the agent, make a callout to agent-force to summarize that account, and then we're going to do some asserts that the agent gave us a result that we are happy with. And we are looking into expanding this to other features that you can't test with traditional tests today. So on the roadmap, we have external services next, and we're also looking into normal HTTP callouts potentially be added to this feature. You can call them like any other Apex tests today. So you can use SF Apex run test from the CLI. You can use our tooling API endpoints to invoke these. The only thing you can't do is the synchronous execution of them is not allowed. They can only be invoked async. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Daniel to talk about some other test development.
Thank you. So hopefully by now you've seen this, well, maybe hopefully not, you haven't seen this scenario. You might have a change you're making to a class, say a controller class. I have made one small mistake. There was a spelling mistake there. I fixed that spelling mistake, and then I deployed it to my org using run local tests. And depending on the org and how many tests on there, it may be significant, right? Like there could be thousands of tests in that org. And they all run, and now this particular org can actually run 1,000 tests in about 26 minutes, so they're pretty efficient tests. Your org may be longer, could be hours, depending on how your tests are set up and how many you have. So that's quite a big overhead to deploy one changed character. Now, in Spring 26, we introduced a beta called Run Relevant Tests. So again, same change, same org, except now when I tell the CLI I want to do my deployment, I say run relevant tests, not run local tests. And that signals to us that we should figure out which tests based on the payload to run and run them in that deployment. And so we do that, and in this case, it identifies only 24 test cases that are needed for coverage of that change class that you're deploying. Now, obviously, 24 is a lot less than 1,300, and so this test class here now runs in about this deploy now runs in about 6 seconds rather than 26 minutes. So we've cut down that deploy time by 99%. You'll be able to cycle those deployments through a lot faster. Now, as part of that change of the run relevant tests and how that mechanism works, we will infer which classes to run based on the contents of the payload, the contents of the metadata deployment. But we also give you a degree of control as well. So if you're using something like reflection, to invoke those classes, it may not be immediately apparent what the dependency between those classes are. So we've given you 2 new annotations on is test. You can indicate that this test is applicable or should always be run when, say, like the account handler class is changed, or say when the account trigger is changed. So if ever there's a metadata deployment with one of those pieces of classes or triggers in that deployment, this test will always be included. You might have other tests in your org that are really important and that you never want them to fail no matter what, and they should be run always. So again, we've given you a critical annotation there. And that means no matter what deployment, run relevant test will always include that particular test case. So what does that actually look like? So let's say I'm doing a deployment and I say run relevant tests. What tests are run? Obviously, if there's any tests in the deployment, they'll be run because they're right there. To add to that, we will do a degree of dependency analysis. We'll go through that tree of dependencies and bring in extra test classes that we find. So obviously, if there's a direct dependency, we'll bring that in. We might do an extra step to bring in more test cases to get your coverage up. And then beyond that, obviously, what we just talked about, if you've got an explicit test for annotation and that class is in the deployment, we'll bring that in. And any critical tests will also come in. We've actually seen, for people who've been trying this pilot, we've seen some of them get improvements in performance time in the 90% range. So it definitely has a lot of potential, and depending on how you've structured your org code base, to greatly increase the speed of your metadata deployments without you having to spell out each and every test that needs to be run via run specified tests. Right, moving on to the App Exchange, improvements coming for ISVs. Historically, a scenario is called namespace shadowing, and that's where the ISV, like in this example, has a custom field on the order object called email, where they store an email to send that's going to go out with that order. And then they install this package into the customer's org, and it also turns out that the customer has a field called email that they want included in the ISV's code. So they want to send emails to both of these email addresses. So the ISV says, no problem. I will run a SOQL query. I will query my field, and I'll get that value. And then I'll also add in the customer's field, and I've got the namespace on my field and no namespace on their field. And they run that SOQL query, and then there's a problem. The system's going to report a duplicate field exception. And that is because when a SOQL query runs within an ISV's namespace, it has an affinity to that namespace. So if it sees any field that matches one in their namespace, it's going to treat it as if it was that query to their namespace. So that essentially means there is no way for the ISV's code to access that email field from SOQL. To work around that, a feature we're going to introduce in Winter 27 is the concept of a query options and set options in SOQL. What this does is it gives the ISV greater control over how that SOQL query resolves the field's namespaces. So they'll be able to explicitly tell SOQL, I want to be explicit in how namespaces are resolved, and they'll have to fully qualify them in their SOQL query. but that means they have the ability to resolve both their field and the customer's field when that query is executed. Right, and then the other area we're looking for improvements for ISVs, and this is further out. Many may be familiar if they've implemented a global method or class and deployed that to customers' orgs. That global is now locked in forever. You can deprecate it, but you can't delete it. So over time, especially for long-running ISVs, they can accumulate quite a collection of deprecated globals that will never go away. In a future release, we're looking to loosen the rules a little bit there or expand them a bit. And what we're going to do is essentially allow the deletion of deprecated globals on major package boundaries. We don't want this going out and changing on every release, but they'll be able to delete those deprecated Apex classes on the major release boundary of their package. Now that also comes with a degree of responsibility. When that package, if they have any subscriber orgs or customers who are still dependent on those globals, they may find that that major package boundary installation is blocked if they still have lingering dependencies on those globals. So there's a bit of a trade-off there, but it is a mechanism for removing the globals. Right, with that, let's go through the roadmap. So there's the features we talked about today, the big important change to secure by default, where you'll need to be explicit or you're going to get secure by default behavior. So it's a safer form of SOCL. We have our multi-line strings and templating for improving the quality of those larger strings you're putting into your code body. The elastic limits beta that Marcus talked about, allowing a softer, more elastic response for when you hit your limit for the system to recover and respond if you only go a little bit over. Again, our existing run relevant tests beta, we'd love your feedback about trying that out, what sort of improvements you see, what sort of challenges you see. And then we've got our new integration tests for doing those larger deployments between like agents and Data 360. And then we've got our new agentic setup dashboards to help monitor the state and the health of the Apex in your org. Going forward, as we said, we're going to start down the path of API reversion retirement. So again, focus on keeping up with the highest API version you can, keeping them consistent will set you in a good place before that starts to come around. And the namespace shadowing solution is coming very shortly. Something we didn't have much time to talk about, but is again related to your async Apex limits, is the concept of a dedicated SKU, or the ability to increase the async Apex limit without having to buy specific user licenses. It'll be a new SKU that's available for purchase that's not tied to user seat count and will increase your async Apex limit. We'll have more information on that as it becomes available. And then, yeah, longer term, allowing ISVs to do deprecation of global, or removal or deletion of those deprecated global classes, expanding our testing framework out for agents, and then moving forward with the API version retirement, starting to make steps through that, and then getting run relevant tests to GA so it's a full-fledged feature.